So hi everyone, I'm Catherine Tofano from the Ridgefield Historical Society. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for the cultural phenomenon of home DNA testing with author Libby Copeland. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, published in March, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? It was recently named to the Guardian's list of the best books of 2020. Tonight's presentation will be a conversation between Libby and Alexa Rome, who graduated with a BS in anthropology and human biology from Emory University. Alexa has research interests in ancient DNA and is currently an intern at the Ridgefield Historical Society. Before we begin, I'd like to give special thanks to our co-sponsor, Books on the Common, where you will find copies of Libby's book. At the end of the conversation, Libby will be taking questions via the Q&A function located on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So you may type in your question and Libby will answer as many as she can. Please welcome Libby and Alexa, and enjoy the presentation.
Hi, Libby.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Catherine and Alexa. It's really a thrill and a privilege to be here.
Yes, we're so excited to have you, and I'm definitely excited to get to talk to you tonight. I think we'll just jump right into it.
Sure.
So you, of course, have written this book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. What inspired you to write it? How did you come to write this book?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for a little over 2 decades, and the stories that have always spoken to me have been stories of, ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. The intimacy of those stories, the people who find themselves shaped and reshaped by the circumstances that they're in. I've always been interested in questions about personal narrative, personal motivation, morality. How do we get to be the people that we are, right? And how do we make the choices that cause us to remake ourselves every day? And so in the last few years, I had moved more into the cognitive sciences, psychology writing, and some hard science pieces. And then I was in conversation about 4 years ago with my editor at the Washington Post, and we were talking about the phenomenon of home DNA testing, which at the time was big, but not as big as it is now. And we were particularly interested in this idea that, there are people who go into it expecting something or not really expecting much at all, and they find some information that upends their understanding of themselves, right? Maybe it alters their sense of their family. Maybe it changes their sense of identity or their understanding of their own ethnicity or race. And it's happening, to enough people that it amounts to, at this point, a kind of a seismic cultural phenomenon. But at the time, I wanted to tell that story through, a handful of human interest stories. And so I wrote that piece for the Washington Post, and it wound up going viral. And what happened was that I got this flood of reader email from people who were in similar circumstances, who wanted to share their story because they wanted to know that they weren't alone, because they wanted other people to know that they weren't alone. They just wanted their stories to be out there, right? And I was reading them, and I was so moved by them. They were totally different circumstances depending on the person, and they were playing out in different ways. But what they shared was this idea that technology was touching us in the most intimate parts of ourselves, right? Our very sense of self, our self-conception, our own memories even. And I was struck by that. I was struck by how vulnerable we are all made. in the face of the ground shifting under your feet when you get a revelation in your genetic results that tells you that that you or your roots or your family are not what you believed. And it was the commonality of those experiences across different demographics that led me to think this is not just a story of one community, right? This is a new American story. And we don't even know that we're kind of embarking on this moment, right? We're blundering into it. And that's what made me want to write The Lost Family.
That's really, really incredible. I think in particular, without spoiling the story, one of the people that you talk about quite a lot is Alice Collins Plebick. Why is her story one that really tells us this story that you're talking about ancient DNA, or excuse me, for home DNA testing? Why her?
Yeah, why that story, right? There's a few reasons why Alice's story is so compelling. The first is that she is just a heck of a character. But the big reason is that her story is incredibly gripping. It's essentially an existential whodunit, and it contains within it other stories, and so it works really well as a kind of a narrative device to pull you through. So I'll back up and just explain. Alice is an American. She's an Irish American. She's Irish Catholic. She grows up in a big family with a very strong sense of their Irish identity and their Irish roots. And she grows up. She has a job. She retires, and she, like many people, gets into genealogy. And she decides in 2012 to take a DNA test, not because she's trying to uncover some big family secret. She knows what she's going to find. But like many genealogists, she figures that DNA is going to help her break through all those brick walls that are constantly befuddling, genealogists. The paper records, they stop at this point, and I can't read them, or how am I going to figure this out? So she gets into genealogy in 2012. This is really the dawn of autosomal DNA testing. And I'll talk a little bit later about, the history of this industry. But the type of DNA testing we're talking about that's available at this point, the industry itself is older, but autosomal DNA testing is the kind of testing that most people are familiar with. And that was really just debuting in 2012. And the databases were quite small compared to what they are now. So she takes this test. She's looking to get that pie chart and some DNA relatives, right? And the pie chart is this, circle that's going to tell you where in the world your people come from, the various branches of your tree come from, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And she knows already going in what it's going to look like. It's going to tell her British Isles, right? It's going to say some Irish, some Scottish, some British Isles. It's going to be all one color, basically. And the shock is that when her results come back, they are not all British Isles. Half of it is what she's expecting. The other half suggests that she is Ashkenazi Jewish, which is a term that she isn't even familiar with at first when she first hears it. It's Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. They have a unique genetic signature that looks different to people who study this than somebody of Irish descent. And at first she figures like, oh, the company's just messed up because it's an ancestry DNA test. They've just released it. It's in beta testing. She figures they don't know what they're doing, right? Because I know my family history, so it must be them who mixed up the vial, don't know how to analyze it. There are a lot of people who go through that process even now of assuming that the company messed up. And frankly, it's almost never the company. It's usually we consumers who have our family histories wrong. But what's interesting about Alice is that she then embarks on this, this detective chase, right, to understand how she got it wrong, like what's the truth here, what's the explanation. She goes through it very methodically by first proposing one theory after another, basically going in descending order of probability. She's this incredible analytical mind. So she figures the most likely explanation for this half unexpected ancestry is that she's the product of an NPE or non-paternity event. Sometimes it's called not parent expected. And it's one of the most common types of DNA surprises and would be the most kind of obvious explanation for, a pie chart that's half not what you expect it to be. But she is kind of dogged in her analysis. She is able to eliminate that theory. And she's able to eliminate all the other most obvious theories, that she's adopted, that she's donor conceived, that her family hid their genetic ancestry as a means of escaping from discrimination or in order to assimilate, and ultimately discovers a mystery, which I won't reveal because the pleasure is in reading it, but like it goes back a century, right? And it's this amazing kind of historical surprise that I had great pleasure in researching. It was really fun to be able to go to the archives and research 100 years back. What is so compelling about that story, in addition to the fact that it has these kind of red herrings and these twists and turns, is that Alice happens to be the perfect person to solve her own story. Most people would have given up because at the time it was really, really difficult to solve given the size of the databases. But Alice had worked in technology and had been someone who worked with data and information processing all her life. And she once told me, she said, "I'm not intimidated by lots of data." And if there are any genetic genealogists here, they will be very excited to learn that what she ultimately wound up doing was creating spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet, where she tracked hundreds of thousands of overlapping genetic segments that she and her siblings shared with thousands of cousins in an effort to find the needle in the haystack, the one genetic segment that would explain her story. So that's why I love Alice's story, and the beauty of kind of unraveling her theories piece by piece is that at each point, like when she explores the possibility that she's the product of what's known as a non-paternity event or not parent expected, I can then delve into some stories of people who took a test and did indeed discover that they were the product of a non-paternity event, and as well donor conception and as well adoption that people were not told about until they took a DNA test. And some of those are stories that came to me because the people emailed me after I wrote that Washington Post story, and some of them are people who I kind of found in my reporting.
And it really is such a pleasure to read kind of how her story comes out. I know I read the book before our talk tonight. Highly recommend that everyone pick it up. That being said, we've kind of been skirting around this issue of what DNA testing is and kind of how it works. Do you think that you could explain that for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So the industry itself is 21 years old. And the very early DNA test kits were very different than they are now. So they were looking at a different kind of DNA, and they were giving you like what you study, Alexa, right? Ancient migration paths, ancient roots, along one line, depending on the test that you took. It was either your matrilineal line, or there was a test called a Y-DNA test that men could take. That was the patrilineal line. Autosomal DNA was a game changer. It came about 10, 11 years ago, effectively even more. 23andMe debuted it. And what it could do was it could tell you your immediate relatives along maternal and paternal sides. That was huge. Because the previous types of DNA, you might match with someone and there was no way of knowing how closely you were related. They could be related to you very, very, very far back, effectively not even making you relatives. Autosomal DNA, the power of that and how you do it is you either spit into a vial up to a certain line, or you swab your cheek so that they can get the cells that are on your cheek or in your saliva and open them up and analyze them. And I have a scene where I go into a DNA lab and I watch the process of them extracting and analyzing. It's really cool. The magic of that is that they are literally able to tell you who in the database is related to you and how closely. Now, they can't always tell you with great precision the nature of the relationship. And sometimes, there may be edge cases where it's a little unclear whether this person is, a first cousin or first cousin once removed, or maybe they're a first cousin once removed or a second cousin, right? They can have difficulty kind of predicting the exact nature of the relationship. And sometimes the degree, but if someone looks like a close relative, they are a close relative, and then it's your job to figure out how. And the other really amazing thing about autosomal DNA testing is that ethnicity estimate, that pie chart I was talking about that Alice was able to get, because the companies are predicting based on reference populations that they've gathered of people with deep roots in all sorts of regions all over the world. They're predicting whether what your DNA looks most similar to. Does it really, really look like a Finnish person's DNA, or maybe a person from a particular region of Finland, for instance? And those results, they get better all the time. The companies are constantly improving, but they are estimates. And that is important to know because each company has its own reference populations, and they each have their own algorithms. And the algorithms are basically like the means by which they crunch the data and make predictions, and they're not always perfect. So it can be difficult to distinguish between two very similar populations. It can be difficult because the contemporary nation states differ from the historical ones, right? So if you're talking about Germany, Germany might not have existed when you are when the DNA you're looking at is being traced back to that, right? That's kind of a modern concept, Germany. And people shifted around. So there's all sorts of reasons why, and they're making guesses sometimes because our DNA, the central lesson of this is that our DNA is very, very identical and very, very shared, right? We share 99.5% of our DNA is completely identical to every other human being. So they're really looking at the exceptions, the specific SNPs that they know to differ and that can be, helpful in them understanding, genetic ancestry, but it's not perfect. And sometimes you'll get something that a scientist from 23andMe described to me over the phone as like background noise, right? Because there was a brief period of time where it was telling me I was 1% Korean. Newsflash, I'm not. And when they updated the ancestry estimate, it went down to 0.1% South Asian. And I was on the phone with him and I was like, what's going on? He said, that's background noise, that's going to go away. And lo and behold, the next update it did. So the important thing to know about DNA testing is that those relative estimates are really robust. And the ethnicity estimates, you take them with a grain of salt, right? So that's an important distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I deal with in some of my work too, where we are constantly updating a lot of these databases. And so all those algorithms, they change, and that's where those updates that you get if you have done a DNA test are getting more and more specific. But even then, you're still dealing with billions of pieces of data in just your own DNA. So it really is quite incredible. Speaking of billions and millions of people, more than 35 million people, most of them in the United States, have taken home DNA tests. What are the implications of so many people? That is, there are 300 million people or so in the US. That's a really substantial portion of the population.
Yeah, so it's actually higher now. It's 37 million DNA test kits sold. And the majority of those test kits are being sold to Americans because we're crazy for DNA testing, much more enthusiastic than other countries. So what does that mean? Well, Pew Research says more than 15% of the US adult population has taken a recreational DNA test. And recreational, by the way, is the broad name for DNA tests that are not given in the context of a doctor's office, not protected by, privacy protections, but, are the kinds of tests we're talking about where you mail it in. So one of the interesting things to know is that because of the shared nature of genetic material, probably everyone, on this talk has many, 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 many cousins already in the databases. So increasingly, there's not so much of a choice about whether you opt in or you opt out of testing. There is, because you may have privacy concerns, you may have ethical concerns, you may have concerns about, insurance discrimination, and, or what's going to happen to that data way down the line. And so your decision not to test or to test is meaningful in that context. But in the context of revelations about the family, your decision to test or not test is somewhat less meaningful, because you may find out things about yourself, your health, your family, your roots, because of the decision of someone else to test. That could be a sister, that could be a third cousin. Because one of the amazing things about DNA testing is that somebody doesn't need to be in the database in order to be identifiable, because you can kind of triangulate cousins. And we know this because, we've known this forever, because, going 10 years back, people who are adopted and people working with them on behalf of them, because they felt strongly that those people should be able to have information. People who are adopted and live in states where they don't have access to their original birth certificates, and therefore don't have access to the information about their birth parents, they pioneered techniques that would help them figure out the identity of their birth cousins from third and sometimes even fourth cousin matches, multiple matches. So in other words, you can discover, if I'm somebody who does not know who my birth mother is, and my birth mother never tested, I may still be able to figure out her identity if I'm willing to put in a lot of elbow grease and genealogical research, and I test and I find some third cousins. Certainly from second cousins, it becomes much easier. The closer the match, the easier it is. And so what that means is that, so I'll give it as an example, right? Let's say I test, let's say I have a brother. He doesn't test, he's not into it, he has privacy concerns, it's too expensive, whatever. But unbeknownst to him, 30 years ago, he conceived a child when he was in high school with his girlfriend, right? She didn't tell him, he doesn't know. And 30 years later, his adult child his child has grown up, she's an adult, she's looking for the identity of her genetic father because she doesn't know it. And she decides to test, and she tests at Ancestry, and we match, right? I'm her genetic aunt. And that is very easy for her then to figure out the identity of her dad. She could do it through reaching out to me, but frankly, she doesn't even need to. She just look me up. I have a prodigious digital breadcrumb trail that she can follow, right? And she can figure out, maybe if I have 3 brothers, she'll write a letter to all 3. She knows one of them is her father, and she writes them. She says, I think one of you is my father. And I write about stories like that in the book, right? And then it's like this interesting moment, right? The brothers have to figure it out. The wives have to know about it, right? It's this very delicate thing that's happening in family after family right now. And how that man feels about his child really, really varies. And how she feels about wanting to know him may really vary, right? And it varies based on a ton of factors, including the circumstances through which that child came into the world. And again, I write about some of those circumstances in the book because they're so variable. So that's a kind of, fine, okay, if your sister tests, then maybe there's the possibility of that coming out. But think about the possibility that I could be his first cousin to this theoretical man who is a father and doesn't know it. I could be his second cousin. I could even be his third cousin. And if you think about the number of third cousins you have whose names you don't even know because they're essentially strangers to you, the fact that their decision to test means that you are affected by this technology is a thing to ponder. And that's part of what I want to kind of get across when I'm talking about this, is that, essentially the age of family secrets is over, right? The moment when you could not tell your child the truth about their genetic origins, that's done. And in family after family right now, there are countless difficult conversations happening between adult children and their parents about, the circumstances of how they came into the world.
I hope nobody in the audience is sweating a little bit too much right now.
They wouldn't be alone. They definitely wouldn't be alone.
Yeah. So we are getting a few questions about NPEs, or those non-paternity events. Could you explain a little bit more about one, what they are and sort of the definition of them, and two, how common this is. How many people are getting
Sure.
NPE events?
Yeah, okay. So NPE originally stood for non-paternity event. It was kind of a term that was used in the genealogical community even before DNA testing. And it's just, kind of disruption in the line for whatever reason, where, like a child that you think is related to a particular father, like turns out not to be genetically related. In the DNA age, it became a term much more commonly because, it was just happening to many more consumers, particularly, as the technology moved out of the realm of serious genealogists and into the realm of the casual consumer. And it also became something that people were translating to not non-paternity event so much, but not parent expected, to indicate that it could be one or both parents that is not genetically related, but typically it's the father. And sometimes people use the term MPE for misattributed parentage experience. And the fact that there's all these terms for it, indicates a number of things. I mean, first of all, it's a growing group of people. They're trying to define the term, with great sensitivity to the experience, and kind of define, the place that they find themselves. This is a very, new place, right? Where technology has kind of like changed your own beginnings, right? And you have to go back and revise your understanding of who you are. And if you look at Facebook, where there are a lot of groups for people to understand their roots through genetic genealogy, you will see that there are a lot of people posting, I am an NPE. It's become this kind of modern form of identity, right? Not I'm the product of an NPE, but I am an NPE. And it often expresses a sense of confusion, dislocation, disorientation. I mean, people, when they discover that they're not related to their dad, some people go in with a suspicion, or they're testing to figure it out, or they don't know their genetic father and they want to know. But, the process of finding out, sometimes they're in middle age or even older, maybe your parents aren't alive to ask anymore, can be deeply traumatic. Some people don't know if they're not genetically related to their dad because their mother had a relationship outside the marriage, or because they were donor conceived, right? And that's kind of a heavy thing to weigh. Or they might not know the circumstances through which they came into the world, and they're concerned that it might have involved coercion or violence, and that's why they were never told. And sometimes that is the case, that is the explanation, right? But the point is that these are things that are rooted in oftentimes in pain and guilt and shame. There are reasons why these are secrets. And now we have this kind of collision, between the act of discovery by the child and the kind of the privacy of the parent. How common is it? Nobody really knows, but it's probably between 1% and 2% across the population, probably closer to 2%, based on the best meta studies that I've seen. I think of it this way. If you look at the two most common kinds of DNA surprises from my research, the two most common kinds, and from interviewing people, the two most common kinds are discovery of an NPE and discovery that you have a previously unknown sibling or half sibling. And that can come about because you're discovering you're not genetically related to dad, but it can also come about because your dad had a relationship outside the marriage, you had another child, or one of your parents had a kid before before they were together. If you look at those two most common kinds of experience, it's probably in the low single digits. Conservatively speaking, it could be higher, but I like to go with a conservative estimate. If it's 3% of the population of people who are testing, that's well over 1 million people who are discovering just those two, one of those two kinds of surprises. But there are many other kinds of surprises. There's the discovery that you're donor conceived. There's the discovery that you're adopted and we're not told. There's hidden genetic ancestry. And I explore a really compelling story in my book about a man with hidden genetic ancestry. So if you look at all those people, though, it's actually a bigger phenomenon, because each single revelation refracts across many people because of the nature of a family, right? So if I learned that I'm not genetically related to dad, it doesn't just have implications for me, it has implications for him. And for his relationship with my mom, he's maybe going to ask her some questions now, right? And my siblings, who I'm now learning are just half genetic siblings, right? And then it also has implications for another family that's maybe like 2 states away, right? There's a man I've never met who is my genetic dad. And now it has implications for him, his relationship with his wife, and his children, who I'm now learning are my genetic siblings. So, each secret has the potential to refract across easily 8 to 10 people. So you're talking about millions of Americans who are kind of grappling with these revelations right now.
And you talk a little bit of you've talked a bit about how they react, but how do families react? Are there do we see a lot of families imploding? Is it more kind of, okay, we've been caught? What in your experience have you seen?
So it's so complicated, and I can't say that I've attempted to do like a scientific breakdown, right, of companies. Families that are accepting versus families that are not, right? And then even within that, it would be very hard to almost titrate because it changes over time, right? When is a rejection not a rejection? When it's just silence in response to an email for 3 months and then you get a reply, right? How would you even, measure that? So, what interested me when I was writing for the Washington Post, then I was writing the book, was the way that newspaper articles tended to portray these stories, and how they tend to portray them is very often, there's a kind of a reunion with genetic kin, and it kind of gets tied up with a bow, and then you kind of leave them behind, right? You leave these characters behind, and you're kind of assuming that they're just going on with their lives. What I found was it's so much more complicated, and it kind of goes on and on. It doesn't really end. So people are processing it, right? And their perceptions of it are changing, and their perceptions are very much dependent on where they stand in relationship to what's been revealed. So there's a category of people in the book I refer to as seekers. Those are people who are very interested in their own roots. They're the people who are testing themselves. And I found that when people are discovering something surprising about their own genetic origins, even when it's painful, even when it's like really upsetting to learn you're not related to dad, or to learn that your family didn't tell you the truth about this older half sister you never knew existed, and you're now in your 50s and you have to try to make up for lost time. Those people learning some truth about their genetic origins would almost always say, but I'm glad to know the truth because it helps me understand myself. It answers unanswered questions. It makes sense of lingering memories that I could never make sense of before. And because it is the truth, right? This is who I am and I want to know. Now, on the other hand, the family that has somebody coming in who is saying, hey, I'm your long lost child, for instance, can feel threatened by it. Or the father's okay with it, but his wife is not. Or the parents are okay with it, but the siblings are not, right? Or very often it's probably the opposite. The siblings are okay and the parents aren't. I mean, because there's sometimes situations where, one sibling, like I write in the book about a woman named Linda, who she found out she was adopted through a DNA test at the age of 51. And this was completely shattering to her. Her mother, her adopted mother's alive. She had not told her, even though she knew that Linda had questions. And when she reached out to her father, her genetic father, who's still alive, he basically said, you seem nice and all, but these phone calls are getting me in trouble with my wife, right? Even though I conceived you before I was married, she's not wild about this. And she was very hurt by that. And she did wind up reaching out to her sisters, who were her father's children. And, some are more accepting than others. So she has these kind of, quiet relationships with some relatives that she doesn't have with others. And that you'll see often, this kind of, having to negotiate. On the other side of the family, She traced her way to her genetic mother, but her birth mother had recently passed away. Her birth mother's daughters, who were in grief, were completely stunned to learn that their mother had had a child before them, right? And had placed that child for adoption. And they found this to be like an assault on their mother's memory. And they found her to be, basically a terrible person for coming into their lives and telling them this. And they basically said, get out, right? Get out of our lives. So, and yet there are stories where people are accepted. And so it's really hard to say, how any one story is going to go. I mean, the takeaway is that seekers, people reaching out, often have very little control over how it's going to go, which means that it's, I guess, in some sense, not personal, but that's not very reassuring when you're in that position.
I can't even imagine, honestly, right. So earlier you mentioned a few different communities, for instance, adoptees, people who are donor conceived. Could you talk a little bit more about how it impacts those communities much more, and what they're sort of doing to deal with that?
Yeah, so, I mentioned earlier that, that adopted community pioneered techniques to figure out their close genetic kin through DNA testing. Before that, if you didn't have access to your birth parents' identities, you might have had to say, and you wanted to know for all sorts of reasons, really compelling reasons to want to know your medical history, your roots, your identity. You might have hired a private investigator, right? And it might have taken years and it might not have ultimately worked. So that is a complete change for people in the adopted community to be able to use DNA. And, back 10 years ago, it would have taken months, maybe years to figure it out with the size of the databases. Nowadays, when you test, you can very quickly, you may very quickly find a first cousin, which is going to make it, or a half sister, right? Which is going to make it much, much easier and more quick to find your birth parents. And same for the donor conceived community. People who are searching the identities of their donor fathers can figure that out really easily. There's a man named Bennett Greenspan who founded the oldest DNA testing company for ancestry purposes in the US called Family Tree DNA, which is still around. It's one of the big four companies. And he said to me that when he gives talks, he says to his audience that his industry has rendered the phrase anonymous sperm donor into an oxymoron akin to the phrase jumbo shrimp. And he is right, because, sperm donors in the 1970s may have signed documents that gave them anonymity, but it is now moot because of this industry. And the other thing that's interesting about DNA testing's effect on our understanding of the fertility industry is there are no legal limits in the US about the number of children that one donor father can conceive. And so you are seeing these documentaries and stories about people who have very, very large families. There are networks of between 100 and 200 half siblings found at this point, perhaps more, right? And so then trying to navigate that is difficult. And one of the stories I tell in the book is a story of a woman named Stephanie who knew she was donor conceived. She didn't know how many siblings she had. She did DNA testing, and the last time we spoke, she had 23, so she was one of 24 siblings. And I wanted to tell that story from the point of view of her, but I also wanted to tell it from the point of view of her donor father. And he talked to me, right? And he was someone who had done sperm donation in the 70s, never anticipating that the age of DNA testing, cheap and easy home DNA testing would ever come, right? As none of us really did. And one of the things they both talked to me about is how to navigate these relationships. What language do you use? If one of his donor children already has a father, he's not trying to take on the role of father, right? So what even do they call him? And what do they call their siblings, and do they call each other siblings, and what kinds of relationships do they have, and what are the practical concerns of trying to forge relationships with 23 siblings? So that's sort of a really fascinating peek into how DNA testing has peeled back our knowledge about another technology.
So there's also one group I think that's of particular interest, and that is often Black Americans, African Americans, whose ancestors were forcibly brought to the United States, and as a result, it's often very difficult for them to trace their ancestries. Is DNA testing helping with that? Is it sort of allowing them to craft some of these narratives? Is there anything with that you found in your research?
Yeah, it's complicated, like everything with DNA testing. It's like DNA testing giveth and it taketh away, right? So it's complicated. Typically, if you're African American, your results may not be as good from DNA testing as if you're a white European American, because historically, certain groups, including African Americans, weren't represented well in genetic databases, and because the people who are testing tend to be white European Americans, so there's a kind of a self-selecting thing at this point as well, with just who's even coming to the product. And I would say for African Americans, there's often the additional concern about the use of genealogical DNA databases for solving crimes, which is something that's started happening in the last few years, and concerns about any kind of police use coming with the possibility of racial bias influencing how it's used. So that's one sort of pocket of concern and challenge. On the other hand, DNA is particularly good for groups that are kind of underrepresented in the records, right? And there's a kind of a handshake between, historical records and people in positions of power, where like the more power you have, the higher up you are at the heap of society, the more likely you are to have records about you and records preserved and to have been literate, et cetera, et cetera. And so just as an example, like if you're African American and you're researching your enslaved ancestors, you are limited by the fact that for instance, in the federal census, you can't get back further than 1870, because all of a sudden that ancestor that you've been tracing disappears because they were enslaved, and so therefore they were not named in the federal census. So how do you get around that? And so in The Lost Family, I do talk about several African American genealogists and how they've used this technology to get around that. Either by researching or either and. I tell a story of one person who's researching enslaved ancestors and kind of recreating their lives, better understanding their lives, and confirming oral history. And another researcher who's able to get back using DNA testing to before the transatlantic slave trade. So he's able to trace his roots. And he's able to do that through those ethnicity estimates, but he's also able to find a present day cousin, an African cousin. So this is somebody who is African, who never left, who is, is related to him many generations back, and is living there now. And he connected with this cousin, and the cousin said, listen, here's who our people were. They came from this particular community. And this genealogist who was doing the research then could look them up, right? And he could see like their language, their food, where they lived exactly, right? He could learn and get himself in touch with his ancestors' lives in this really immediate way that would absolutely not have been possible through traditional genealogical methods.
That is so incredible. And I can't imagine how exciting that would be. And we certainly can imagine a lot of the genealogists in the talk are probably like, whew,
yeah,
because that is how I would react for sure.
Amazing, yeah.
But you did mention a little bit about crime. And I know this is something that's come up quite a bit. And I also just want to encourage our audience members to send in some more questions, because we'd love to get Libby's eyes on them. But again, you mentioned crime. The Golden State Killer case in particular is one that was very widely publicized, where they used familial DNA in order to solve the crime. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How is law enforcement gaining access to these? Should they be able to? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's a great topic. The techniques that they use to solve the Golden State Killer case. So Golden State Killer, serial murderer and rapist, right? Thought to be responsible for at least 13 homicides and at least 50 rapes. And he's been since sentenced for those murders, and he's in jail. Joseph James D'Angelo, he was arrested in 2018, and the techniques that were used to capture him were techniques that had already been around for, at that point, about 7 years. And they were the exact techniques that I was talking about earlier, that those in the adopted community developed to figure out the identity of their birth parents. So the breakthrough was not the techniques. The breakthrough was the application by, members of law enforcement into databases where genealogists, family history researchers had put their information with the idea that this was going to be used for family history research and to connect with relatives. So, the problem with sort of anticipating, and I mean, there's so many instances with DNA testing where people don't anticipate the ways in which it's going to be used, right? And so the problem for a third-party website called GEDmatch, which was the place where this was, among others, was broken open, but it was the most publicly known for a long time, was that they didn't at least publicly see it coming, right? So they didn't have kind of protections in place. Although a lot of other people did see it coming, they didn't kind of have, a kind of a policy that would let people know that their information could be used that way. And so there was a sense, I think, among some genetic genealogists, a sense of betrayal, right? Like, I trusted you, I put my information in here for this one purpose. I didn't consent to have my DNA used in this way. Even if you are in favor of getting a serial killer off the streets, and I would say, probably everyone is, you can have concerns about police access to DNA information, right? And protections for that information. And so the debate has really split in many ways between like privacy experts and civil libertarians and public safety advocates. And most Americans are not overly concerned about this. That's something that I've seen from polling, right? And I think that has to do with the people that they've been arresting, which are, pretty bad people. After the Golden State Killer, there have been since then, by one estimate, 200 cold cases that have been solved this way. They're mostly cold cases. Sometimes they're more recent. And there are concerns about a slippery slope, right? When do you use this? When do you not? There's not much in the way of like guardrails or proper processes that law enforcement agencies and the FBI have to use. So that's sort of maybe something that will get tackled in the future. It's a little unclear how that's going to be used. But one thing to know is that for a number of years, it was understood that GEDmatch was the means through which this was solved. And GEDmatch is kind of a hobbyist website. It's a third-party website. You can't actually test your DNA through there. You can just upload your information from, a place like Ancestry or 23andMe. But in fact, 2 other places were also used, 2 private, for-profit DNA databases, Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage. And they both have kind of loopholes, I would say, where people can go in and upload kits. You can't do that at 23andMe and Ancestry. So it's important to know, if you're concerned about your DNA being used in this way, or you're all for it, it's important to kind of educate yourself about the landscape, because your DNA is relatively more or less possible to be used in this way, or relatively more or less protected from that use, depending on where you're sending it. And that's important to know.
Thank you for that. We have a related audience question, which is great. And that is, do these testing companies have the right to share and sell our genetic information? In this case, right, it was given to law enforcement, but can they sell it too? Can they use it for profit?
If you give them permission. And this goes to one of the issues that I kind of talk about sometimes on talks and in the book, which is, read the fine print. But how likely are you to read the fine print when you're online? And that's a bit of an issue, right? We do tend to click, yes, I agree, to consent to things, just because we want to get onto the next page. However, I would say that, for instance, 23andMe is relatively good about letting you know, and Ancestry, I would say as well, they are asking you for very explicit consent about whether you want this information shared with third-party researchers or not. And you can consent and you can withdraw your consent at any time. And if you're not consenting to it, then they're telling you that they're not going to use it that way. And they have, policies in place that stipulate that they're not using it that way. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's their relationship with you that's on the line, right? It's their contract with you that's on the line. It's not really protected by any other agency. It's not as if HIPAA, which is, what protects your medical information, is going to step in at any point and protect you, right? But to the degree that these companies want to protect their relationship with their customers, and they know that privacy is going to be important to their customers, they're going to kind of try and follow through. And that's actually part of the reason why the two big companies have been so robust in saying that they're going to fight, like law enforcement access, for instance. They will fight it legally. They will try to restrict it because they're extremely aware that people like you are writing in with very legitimate concerns about how far is this information going to go, right? I'm trusting you with it because I want to know some information, and I've paid you to analyze it. And are you now going to take it and make more money off of it without telling me? And I would say the contracts say that they're not going to do that. And I have not seen information indicate that otherwise. But, one of the concerns that people have is, what happens 30, 40 years down the line if a company gets bought by another company and they have a different policy about, how they're going to treat this genetic information? And will you even be able to delete it at that point? It's hard to predict the future because we've never been here before.
Absolutely. We're getting lots of great audience questions. Some of them are a bit related. One in particular is asking about these updates that the genetic companies will give and sort of finding them confusing. Why is that changing? Why are they getting these different results as sort of time goes on?
Yeah, ostensibly because they're getting better, right? And they're growing their reference population. So I'll just give you as an example. When I was writing the book, I was tracking the size of the reference populations for specific communities at, I think it was Ancestry, right? And they might have had, say, I'm just going to pull a number out of the air, 100 people standing in for, an entire region in, let's say, Southeast Asia, okay? As I was writing the book, they pushed out a big update. And as part of that update, they, greatly enhanced their reference populations. Now, all of a sudden, that same region that had 100 had 1,000 people, right? And those are people with deep roots in that region. They have all 4 grandparents going back. And those are people that, the companies analyzed their DNA and they said, this is what this is one example of what the DNA of a person from this particular region looks like. So when they have 1,000 people, that's a much better kind of results for you. It's giving you much more kind of granular results. It might help distinguish between particular regions within a particular region, depending. Some of the companies are unveiling now, communities within regions, it can get pretty, detailed. So that's part of it. And the other thing is they're tweaking their algorithms. So they're learning. So they're finding actually, this SNP that we thought was Iberian Peninsula, turns out it's not. It's actually just a British SNP. Sorry about that. And all of a sudden, poof, a whole population of people suddenly discovered that they're not Spanish, right? And they've been wondering that whole time.
And you're absolutely, it is so funny how often it changes. Even in some of the work that I do, we have the same thing going on. We're like, we think this has to do with malaria. No, never mind. It has absolutely nothing to do with malaria. It's probably just actually useless and noise. There's another question kind of similar, in a similar vein, is how far back are these genetic tests going? For instance, could you go far back enough where everybody has sort of African DNA? What would you sort of say to that?
Yeah, not with autosomal tests. I mean, autosomal is designed to be anywhere from, say, like 500 to 1,000. Like, it'll vary depending on the company, 500 to 1,000 years back. If you're looking to go further back, then, you're using either Y DNA if you're a man, or mitochondrial DNA, which is something that men and women can do because everyone inherits it from their mothers. And if you're doing that, you're only looking at one path, right, along your tree, one branch. You're not getting that kind of broad sweep of both parents and all of their roots.
So I think we're almost out of time. So I think we'll kind of loop back to maybe a bit of a fun ending question, and that is, have you taken a home DNA test, and did you find anything interesting?
Yeah, so I've taken 3, and we found amazing stuff, right? I mean, and again, DNA giveth and DNA taketh away. Like, it's so complicated, right? I mean, you have incredible access to the immediacy of the past, and then sometimes people are not happy with what they find, right? And for me, I found it astonishing, and I'm frankly quite excited that I did it. We were able to find relatives that we wouldn't have known about, that we would not have known were alive. A second cousin to my dad, a second cousin to my mom, one of them in Sweden through my dad's side, and one of them who was born in Ukraine through my mom's side. They were Ukrainian Jews, and they survived all that the 20th century would have had to throw at Ukrainian Jews through a branch of the family my mom didn't know was living. Right? And this is stuff that, like, there's no paper records that are going to show you, at least that we easily have access to. And same goes with my dad's Swedish side. Like, there was a break in the line, so there were no paper records that would have indicated we had these cousins back there. We wound up flying to Sweden to meet them. Like, I mean, that was like our family trip that year.
Oh, wow.
And we hooked up with a local genealogist who was like, I have been studying this region forever, and I would be pleased as punch to show you around for free. And, we gave him a bunch of information. Our Swedish cousin gave him a bunch of information, and he took us to all the sites in my dad's grandmother's life from before she emigrated in the 1890s from Sweden as a teenager, right? So we got to see, like, her physical house, or at least the foundations of it, the farmhouse, and, like, get a sense of, like, the poverty that she was escaping, right, when she left. We saw the literal church where she worshiped. We saw the actual physical school that she went to. We saw some of the desks that were in that classroom when she was there. That was mind-blowing. And this was a woman who helped shape my father's life, and by extension mine. So I feel like genealogy and DNA can be an extraordinary gift in giving us access to the past that we thought was over, and we realize it's actually sitting with us right inside ourselves, like waiting for us to uncover it.
Libby, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. This is absolutely fabulous. And The Lost Family, everyone, check out the book. Thank you for sharing your research with us. And Alexa, thank you for your great moderating skills. Wonderful to have you on the call today. So thanks everyone for joining us. I just want to invite you to our next webinar, which is Deemed a Runaway, Black Laws of the North, coming up on Sunday, March 21st at 3 p.m. And please visit our website at ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org. This presentation will be has been recorded and will be up on our website next week. So thank you, Libby. And there'll be some extra bonus information that Libby's willing to share with us that will be also available next week. So thanks again to both Libby and Alexa, and good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.